Hello everyone and welcome to This Nintendo Life episode 198. My name is NVZ and I don't know if I sound any different, but maybe I do because I have been coughing up a storm. I have been having a rough time with a hay fever going to my chest and being a goddamn nightmare, and so I will probably be editing out a bunch of coughing in this episode so you don't have to listen to my horrible death throes. Unfortunately, Bally, who is hearing the live experience, will have to endure it. Bally, welcome. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. You have had these hay fever related coughing fits in the past. So
I have, yeah.
We can get through this. We can do it.
We can do it. This is definitely worse than any I've had before. That is definitely true. But anyway, it's the show must go on. We haven't missed an episode in 7-8 years, whatever it's been. Got to do it. Got to keep going. So yes, we are back after E3. It was a fun time. Nintendo stealing the show, of course. I don't think there's any kind of doubt in anyone's minds that they were the best show at the show. And we'll be talking about some of that stuff. Bally, how are you feeling after a week or so removed from Nintendo stuff?
Yeah, positive. There's a lot coming out this year, and you can't really say that about Nintendo very often at all, really.
No.
And yeah, I think Nintendo often put themselves in this position where the rest of the show is fairly lukewarm. I thought that was the case again this year, but then the door is always open for Nintendo to come in and steal the show, and they often they always go last. So it kind of felt like this time they actually kind of stuck the landing for once, which they don't often do when that sort of winning opening is there for the taking.
Yeah, for sure. So we're going to talk a bit about that. Bally, what are we going to be talking about in the show today?
2-segment show today. First segment, we're going to talk about the games that we have been playing, and then second segment, we're just going to check back in with Nintendo at E3, go over our predictions, have a little chat about some of the stuff we saw at Treehouse and any other bits and pieces to pick up.
Yep, sounds good. Excited for what is coming later this year. But Bally, you have been back in time, one might say, but it's kind of relevant in a sense to the recent Breath of the Wild trailer, where people had lots of chatter on the internet about is there time travel in this one? What's happening? But you've been playing a Zelda game where there is time travel.
Yes, I've now beaten the Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages. You played both of these a while back, and I'm now back to Zelda parity with you, MBZ. We now played the same number of Zeldas and the same Zeldas,
yes.
which is nice. So, I had a really great time with this game. It sounds silly, but in some ways, in every way, I think that Nintendo are still the best when it comes to 2D Zelda. I don't think there's other games that have kind of surpassed 2D Zelda where you think, wow, that 2D dungeon was really good. That's better than Zelda. And I think even a 2D Zelda from 2001 has some incredible design in it. And I actually had my favorite thing of this game was actually the dungeons, apart from one. So out of the 8 dungeons, I had an absolute stellar time with about 7 of them. They were just the right amount of puzzle and difficulty where I didn't go to a guide for any of the dungeons bar one, and just really paced myself, took my time, and really enjoyed these are some really fantastic dungeons. Now I will say the one dungeon, Jabu's Belly, and I'm not talking about the Ocarina of Time one. I'm talking about Oracle of Ages.
It's interesting, isn't it? When I was kind of leading up to, it's a Zelda game about time travel, I was like, wait a second, we have one of those that's the biggest one, which is Ocarina of Time, but Oracle of Ages, I guess it came out, did it come out before or after? I feel like it came out after, because...
Yeah, this is decent time math. This is 2001, and
yes.
Ocarina was, 96, 98?
Right, yeah. So the interesting thing, actually, you said no one makes it better than Nintendo. The ironic thing is these games were made by Capcom, but of course Nintendo heavy influence on these games. And I think they have Twin Rover in them at the secret final boss. Which is what I didn't ask you this. I didn't know if you remembered it. You can put your code in from the previous game.
Yes. So when I beat Seasons, that was the first thing I did before doing anything else was start Ages, put in the code. So I knew whenever I came back to Ages, it would all be linked up. So yeah, I did have
cool. So you did do the proper final ending with Twin Rover and stuff like that.
Right, and all the stuff that follows that as well, because there's a lot at the end. And Yeah, I like this game. Getting back to Jabu Jabu, like there's actually this game far more so than Seasons really not crutches, but utilizes a lot of the traditional Zelda lore and races. So like you have Zoras in there. There's a Zora town. There's like Gorons up the mountain. Like, and I don't feel like Seasons had any of those. Like it felt very different to those. And obviously Seasons has like what is it? Subrovia?
Subrosia.
Subrosia. What a great name. And I wasn't a big fan of that stuff, but I must say that this Oracle of Ages stuff with the time travel to go back, I found a lot of the overworld stuff not the most fun. And
right
in the build up to Jabu Jabu's belly, there's the dive mechanic, which is interesting because that came into Pokemon later, but like there's the dive mechanic combined with these islands, combined with going forward and back in time, and it was just like, this is just miserable, like this level of detail to try and just get from dungeon to dungeon.
It's just like complexity on complexity in a way that isn't enjoyable to figure out and is just confusing in a way. And that is definitely one of my takeaways from Oracle of Ages was, I remember there's like a tropical kind of island area you're at, and like moving a boulder in the past and going back and finding the route there, I remember being a real pain in the arse and not very fun to figure out.
Yeah, that's quite early on and it's quite tough. Yeah, it's one of those things where I think that a game like Link to the Past and a game like Link Between Worlds, which kind of is inspired by that game, the pacing of the world to get between dungeons is much quicker. So the dungeons themselves, I think, they often are shorter, but the pacing to get between dungeons, often you can just in Link to the Past, you can just walk up to a dungeon, walk in, and you're going. Like the pacing in between dungeons in a game like Oracle of Ages and Seasons, there's a lot more to do in dungeons. I almost broke up my play sessions as, right, either you do a dungeon in a play session or you get to a dungeon in a play session. So like the amount of time it took to get from the end of a dungeon to the start of the next one was almost identical to the amount of time it took to do a dungeon. And I like that in terms of pacing. I just don't like all the stuff you had to do. A lot of it was a bit overly finicky, and early on that stuff is really good in Ages. I think it's good, but when you get that mechanic to go back and forward in time, the level of complexity just becomes a bit obtuse and not the most amount of fun. So yeah, and like I was saying, Jabu Jabu's Belly is a truly miserable dungeon. It's all the worst aspects of having a water dungeon with multiple levels but in a 2D setting, and on top of that, I feel like there's a water dungeon with water levels in Minish Cap, which I really enjoyed. And likewise, when I played the water dungeon finally in Ocarina of Time on the 3DS, I actually found it okay. And I know that had like labeling put in after, but this game is seriously obtuse, that dungeon. It is not good at all in Oracle of Ages. So I'm glad that, you know, I just used the guide and did the whole thing. And I was really worried that the 8th dungeon would be more of the same, and it really wasn't. The 8th dungeon was actually one of my favorites and really designed impeccably well. I thought, like, I was very impressed.
Yeah, and I think this game, for me, it's the weakest of the three, and that's not necessarily for any reason outside of the time stuff. Like, for me, that is a really unique and interesting idea, but I think because it works on the scale of the entire overworld and the ways at which it changes things and makes understanding where to go and how to get places the challenge for me. And I think we always talk about this when it comes to Zelda dungeons and design and those types of things, I'm always more on the side of stuff that is not necessarily more linear, but a bit more directed and a bit more about the individual puzzles within the spaces versus the puzzle being finding your way through the space. I'm not a huge fan of finding your way through the space in Zelda dungeons, even though I feel like that's, for a lot of people, what they like, especially in the 2D games where it's so hard to keep track of like the underground stuff, right? And I can't remember, is the underground stuff in this game still, where you like go down a ladder and there's a staircase that leads to another area? That for me is the most confusing part of the Game Boy games, and I just don't think it was well handled. They could have done a much better job of showing you like where this one leads to, where you will come out of, because it just adds that level of complexity to the dungeons that is just more confusing rather than satisfying to me.
And they fixed that with the Link's Awakening remake, where they give you like stamps that I utilized in the dungeons, where I'd stamp where Link went down into
Yes.
an underground area, and then I'd stamp where he came up with like a star or something. It would show that.
Oh, it was so much more convenient doing
Right.
that. Obviously, I think Nintendo themselves should have just put that on the map anyway.
Yes.
But I guess because it was more of a straight-ahead remake, they wanted to like give you the option to do it, but not like take away from quote-unquote purists if they didn't want to. So.
Yeah. And I agree with you what you're saying about like localized puzzles versus, working your way through an area. And I think a game that does that incredibly well is the Breath of the Wild, where you have shrines that are these puzzles unto themselves. And that's not to say there's still overworld puzzles in that game, but even those overworld puzzles are often more localized. And I think that game does a fantastic job of saying, right, here's a shrine, it's a mini dungeon, it's a puzzle unto itself, and everything you need is within these four walls, and we're not going to like aid you with other stuff and this sort of thing. And I really like that. So I think it's interesting that idea has kind of evolved in certain ways. And just generally, I think for a game that is from 2001, like it is weird to think that Minish Cap was just like 2 or 3 years later. And we said this when we played Seasons and you had played Ages back a while ago, but it is shocking the amount of time between these games and Minish Cap, where I do think Minish Cap, especially in the overworld stuff, but also just the design, the music, it's just a really vibrant game in comparison to these Game Boy games. Like I think there's a huge step up to that game. And of the 3 games like Link's Awakening, Seasons and Oracle, like much of a muchness for me. I think they both have their positives and their weaknesses, but I do think Link's Awakening is just a slightly slicker, slightly easier game generally, and
interesting.
As a result, I like it more for that. I think.
Do you think the remake has influenced your take on Link's Awakening there?
I mean, that was already I already preferred Link's Awakening to Seasons before the remake came out.
See, I think Seasons is better than Link's Awakening. I honestly, when I played Seasons, I was like, wow, this is more streamlined. The dungeon seems smarter. It has more interesting mechanics, like the magnet. Like, it just felt overall a more polished, better version of Link's Awakening to me. So it's interesting that you kind of feel that is still better than the Oracle games.
Yeah, and I'd be interested if they do remake the Oracle games at some point, because I do think they're definitely worthy of that. I think there's stuff that can be improved, and there's some really good design in there. Like and I'm glad they didn't go for making it 3 games that all link together instead of 2, which was the original plan.
Yeah, man,
which is wild, because I was reminded of that at the end of the game where I think Nehru is the main sort of goddess in Ages, and then is it Din is the other one in
I believe
Seasons.
So, yeah.
And then I can't remember the name of the third.
Furore is the third goddess.
Furore. Yeah. So
I always say Furore, but yes.
Furore, like Kyogre. But the fact she didn't have her own game, I think, is probably a positive. I think 3 would have just been slightly too much. But cool. Yeah, I think they're 3 fantastic games, honestly. I think 2D Zelda is... we have not had much 2D Zelda in the last decade. We've had a remake and we've had Link Between Worlds, and that's honestly not a great deal, which is a real shame. And I hope for either more remakes or more original games. I think it's just such a strong concept. And like I was saying at the start, like it's not really something a ton of other developers have dove into a ton or done successfully. Like sure, there's a few Zelda-like games, but that process of like really well designed puzzles in dungeons in a 2D setting, it's not quite as common, especially when compared to something like Metroidvanias, where we've seen numerous high quality Metroidvanias that have in many ways surpassed Metroid and Castlevania games. I just don't think 2D Zelda is in anything like the same space, which is quite interesting, the state of the industry in that sense.
Yeah, no, it's cool that it's one of those. It's kind of like 3D platformers, right? Like nobody touches Nintendo when it comes to that type of game, and yeah, I think Zelda design is definitely another one of those where they kind of have a game's
very good.
It's not a fucking 3D platformer, mate. You shoot people in that game. That's not the main verb of that game. I refuse to call Ratchet & Clank a 3D platformer. Like everyone does that. They're like, oh, it's a mascot platformer. No, it's not. It's a third-person shooter, motherfuckers. That's what that game is. Anyway, yes, that's my
mascot shooter.
It's a mascot shooter, absolutely. There we go. Yeah, that's my I will die on that hill. Anyway, from one Zelda game to maybe kind of another. So, Bally, tell me everything you know about Ever Oasis. It was a game that came out in 2017.
It's a game that came out on 3DS nearish the end of the life cycle, and no one gave a crap about it, including me. And it reviewed okay, I think.
Yeah.
Didn't make waves, and then the Switch came out, and no one talked about it ever again.
Pretty much, yes. The other interesting thing, it was made by Grezzo, who made the Ocarina of Time remake. I believe they made the Majora's Mask one as well, though I might be wrong on that. But yes, they did the Zelda 3DS stuff. And then Nintendo were like, well, how about you make your own game? Let's give you a chance to make your own thing. And
Link's Awakening.
Yes, yeah, obviously on Switch afterwards. Maybe that's why they haven't made their own game since, because they made Ever Oasis and it did nothing. And yeah, so it came out in June of 2017, which was, a few months into the Switch's life cycle. So
I didn't realize it was after the Switch came out.
It was, yeah. Same year as Metroid Samus Returns. So 3DS was having a kind of swan song year, and these games coming out. And yeah, Ever Oasis is a really interesting concept and a cool game. And I had a great time with it, honestly. I think the word I would use to describe it is light. Light in every sense. It's a very kind of bubbly, kind of cartoonish, chibi world with these characters that are these little kind of bumbling characters of different races. The main ones are the seedlings, and that's who you play as. You play as a seedling. And the start of the game is you and your brother own this big oasis. But then, the evil chaos comes along. And obviously everyone's been talking about chaos the last week or so because of that stupid Final Fantasy game. And that one dude who just keeps saying, chaos. I'm here to kill chaos. And ironically, like, that's kind of what this game is like as well. It's like, chaos has come, we must stop it. It is terrible. In the sense of, like, there's not really a great story here. Like, they tried to do some stuff, but it's very generic and kind of fantasy and that type of thing. But the chaos comes and destroys your oasis, and you get flung away into the desert and saved, and then you find this water spirit, and there's only one water spirit left. You're the only seedling left who's like the child of the great tree, and you have the power to create an oasis. And so you try to make the last oasis left and try and build it up. And so this game is a mix of town building and exploration / action, kind of Zelda-y style dungeon puzzles, that type of thing. And it's really cool. I like all the things involved, all the kind of little elements of it. But as I said, it feels quite light. The combat is very simple, right? Like, you have an AAA combo, and then you have AAX. It's like light attack, heavy attack. You can lock on to enemies. You can have a dodge roll around them. And there's not a lot more to it than that. A lot of it is like dodging out of the way, using the timing window to hit enemies. And the different characters that you gain to your village will become party members as well. So people who join the Oasis, you can then, once they're a resident, you can get them to make a booth, a bloom booth, which is where they will sell their goods and their wares. And there's this whole mechanic, basically, of these little penguin? I wouldn't call them penguins, because that doesn't make much sense in an oasis. It's all fucking desert. They're like little bird guys. They're called newts. And they come to your oasis to buy stuff, basically. So the idea is, as people join the oasis, you build these bloom booths, which is where people sell, like, they'll have a scarf shop, there'll be a juice shop, there'll be a, I don't know, some other thing, some random thing that wants to be sold to these individuals. And you have this kind of back road, this main road filled up with these booths, and every day these characters come along, they buy stuff from there, and that's how you make money. So you build up your currency by having these shops, but the thing is, you have to keep the shops stocked, and the shops need stuff like cactus pulp from the desert. So the push and pull here is that you go out into the desert, and the desert is kind of this big open space. There are a few open spaces throughout the game, maybe 3 like big hub areas, and there are caves like around the desert, which is where kind of the dungeons and other kind of puzzle underground areas are based. So yeah, you go out and you collect these resources, bring the resources back, and restock the shops. So every time you come back, you're restocking, and you are making sure that all of your villagers, your oasis dwellers, have enough stuff to sell to people when they come along. And at the beginning, I was doing a lot of this kind of tending to that, making sure that everyone was fully stocked up. You know, there's a thing where, depending on how much money they get spent on them, then you can fill out this card, which like starts a festival, and when a festival happens, like 100 different people come to your oasis, and they all spend money. So it is this interesting, like, building that town and getting all this currency, I realized after a point I wasn't using the currency for much. I wasn't buying anything, and there wasn't really much I could spend it on. And there's a whole like garden mechanic where you can buy seeds and plant those, and you can assign some of your Oasis members to do the garden and tend it for you. You can send people out on an exploration thing where they go and get resources, gather them back for you. But really, I was like, wait a second, I'm not really spending this money on anything interesting. I think it would be nice if there was a bit more kind of visual customization stuff you could do in your Oasis to make it look a bit nicer and pop a bit more, because it does upgrade, and you, depending on how many residents you get, it will eventually level up, and you will level up your Oasis, and it will change the look of your room, and it will change the look of some of the spaces. But I wish there was a bit more to spend that on, which is why like the second half of the game I was far less focused on building up my Oasis and making sure I had a bunch of people there. But the actual kind of exploration and combat stuff is fun. Like it's not. This is, I think, overall, my thought on this game is it's the definition of a 7, right? Like, it doesn't do anything spectacular, but it doesn't do anything badly either. Like, I think it's super competent in a lot of the way that it feels and it looks, and it's nice to play a 3DS game again that uses 3D. We always talk about that, how lovely it is, and I think the kind of cute, chibi style of this game comes through super nicely with that stuff, and especially in some of the bigger boss fights with some really cool designed enemies. It creates a bit of a spectacle in a game that you might not expect that from, which is really nice and I think works really well. There are a few like little hiccups here and there, I would say, in terms of, so all these villagers that you get, they all have abilities. They have different weapons they use in combat, obviously. So some of them have like a crossbow. There are these kind of this race of, I guess, kind of dragony type, like they're kind of lanky, draconic style people called the Drauk. There are these, there's this race called the Shirka tribe, who are kind of rock guys and they wield big hammers. There are these bunny rabbit guys who have these kind of ninja blades and they attack really fast. And so it's really nice kind of melting pot of these different kind of races that they've created for this game and this world to flesh it out a bit. And so all of those villagers will have those weapons, but they'll also have different abilities, which means that when you're in these spaces, you might sometimes need a specific ability to progress. However, your party is only 3 characters. And so what this game could have done, and it would have been really bad, was you get through a dungeon, you get to a room where you don't have any abilities, and you have to go back out the dungeon and do it. But the game doesn't do that, thankfully, because that would have been a fucking nightmare, because the amount of times this happens. You have this ability called the Aqua Gate, which lets you instantly warp back to your Oasis, and then warp back to where you were, so that you can have the right party members. The reason why this is a little awkward, and I don't think it was necessary, or really necessary, is I wish there was a way for you to just change your characters while you're there, because really what you do is you aquagate back to your Oasis. The person who is, there's a guy at a desk who basically does a bunch of like admin-y thing, which is like assigning your gardeners and assigning an exploration team and that type of stuff. He also lets you, 1, change your equipment, which you can't do when you're outside for some weird reason, and 2, lets you change your party. So oftentimes what would happen is I have my main crew, my main kind of like attacking crew, because like I wanted to build up levels for the people who were doing the most damage, the people who would be best in fights, so that I could take on bosses and stuff easily without having to worry. And so I would switch those guys out then for like, oh, I need a guy who has a pellet ability. The pellet is like you turn into a little morph ball and you go through a hole and you access a new area. Or there's one guy who has a paraglide ability. So you pop into these little flower areas and it pops you up and you can paraglide over to some space. So sometimes you need multiple of these. So I'd go back, change my party out to those guys, warp back to that space, do the puzzle, then warp back, change my party out again to the attacking guys, and then warp back once more. So it's a lot of like back and forth just so that I can get through this one part of the dungeon, and it would have been just way more streamlined had I been able to just switch out party members from a menu within the dungeon space, you know. And the same with equipment, right? One of the characters I had, the main character, Tethy, she can use different weapons, and so some of the weapons, like a crossbow, is needed for hitting switches that are far away, but for the most part I was using a sword because it was more powerful in combat. I wish I would been able to just switch out to the crossbow in the menu instead of having to go back to the town and then switch to that, or just take a different character who has a crossbow, right? So again, these are like minor nitpicks in a sense, because it wasn't that inconvenient. It was just a little time wasty in some ways that felt like it could have been streamlined a little bit more. But yeah, otherwise I think it is a pretty smooth experience. I wouldn't say that the dungeons or the puzzles get that complicated, as I just said, like, because you know what abilities you need, it's more about going and getting those characters and then executing on it, rather than figuring out what you have to do necessarily. Like, there are a couple of times where I felt, oh, I'm not sure quite exactly what I have to do in this space, but it didn't take me long to figure it out, right? It wasn't like taxing in the same way that Zelda dungeons can really scratch that itch and like get you going of like, oh, and I feel really good for figuring that out. It was more a process of like just going through the motions and doing it, rather than anything else. So yeah, took me about 20 hours to go through the whole thing. And as I said, like I tended the Bloom booth stuff quite a lot early on, and you go into them and you chat with them and you restock and all that stuff. But eventually the Oasis becomes so big that you have like multiple roads of shops, and eventually the Oasis itself has a bunch of teleportation stuff within it. So it is like, it understands that you really want convenience out of this game, and it gives you a lot of that convenience. In some ways it doesn't quite make it, but I think overall I really had a good time. So yeah, awesome. Any thoughts, Bally? Are you interested in checking this game out at any point in time?
It seemed I'm not that invested in 20-hour games when they're 7s, to be honest.
Yeah, no, totally.
I do like to make sure that I'm very pernickety when it comes to like my longer games or like RPG style games, and I'll be like, right, has this got good reviews? Did MBZ like it? Am I going to like it? Who else liked it? And I need to like make sure it ticks lots of boxes before I invest a lot of time. So probably not.
Yeah, I think you're much I think you're much more astute with what you play, whereas I am much more willing to play something that's not amazing for the sake of interest.
Oh, I will totally play something that's not amazing if it's 5 hours, 10 hours or under.
Oh yeah,
But when it comes to like 20-hour games, they do have to have like a certain level of quality that I'm reassured of before going in.
Yeah, that makes sense. I don't have that, so that's kind of what my MO is here. Is like, yeah, I'm gonna just put a bunch of time into this thing, even if it's like not blowing me. And the thing is, like, I had a great time.
But also a lot of the games that I'm playing where I'm like, yeah, these are really high quality, and I really want to keep this level of quality, like are games that you've already played. So my point is like, yeah, the well of riches at my disposal is kind of a bit deeper than what you have at the moment, because you've already played a lot of the great stuff over the last 5-6 years or so.
For sure, yeah. But I think for me, it's also like, I was always interested in this. It's a curiosity thing of the 3DS as a platform, and I got it recently, picked it up at a decent price because it was at Argos, and I was like, I'm going to get this because I want it to be part of my library, and I want to have a bunch of 3DS games that I missed out on. It's just, yeah, it is a curiosity thing more so than anything else, but I don't want to dissuade people, because I think some people will really love this game, and I think it is honestly a great time, and I had a great time playing it. So I don't think like putting a 7 on it is a negative. I think like some games are just, they're not doing anything new or special, but they're still really good. And I think that's what this game falls into. It falls into that category of, you know, you'll really enjoy this if you're someone who likes this type of system, you know, where it is this balance between exploration and action, but also these kind of simish elements of building up a town and making it look cool and interacting with villagers. And that's one other thing I would say is a little weird about the game is doing the side quests. Every Bloom booth, you can do a side quest for the character in it, but also people who join your village, they'll only join it after you've done something for them. So either you find them out in the wild and help them there, or they come to your town randomly and they'll be like, oh, I need this thing, or I need you to go to this area and find a thing. Kind of very basic fetch quest stuff, but those quests, for some reason, you can only take one at a time, and I never really understood why that was the case. Like, I like in RPGs and games like this where you can just stock up on side quests and then spend like an afternoon just going and doing all of those, right? Whereas this felt like, okay, I've got to do this one, so I'll focus on this one, then I'll go do the next one, and I have to go back to the person to reactivate it. It just felt like a little, again, like slight bit of clunkiness in a game that otherwise is full of convenience, and like there are loads of warp points all over the place, and you can warp to these dungeon areas that you want to. The other thing is like, to heal yourself, if you want to, you can just aquagate back to the Oasis, and the Oasis will like heal you, and then you go back to where you were in the dungeon. So it feels designed for handheld play, is what I'm saying. Like it really, they thought about it in that sense of these are quite long, play sessions you'll probably have going through these dungeon areas. So we want to make it convenient for people to just get back, save their game whenever they can do, and that's exactly what they do. So yeah, loads of really cool, convenient things that they made, but a couple of things that could have done a bit of work on. But yeah, overall, really satisfying game, very, very cool, and I think people should give it another look, and maybe it'll release on Switch at some point instead of fucking Miitopia. God damn it, Nintendo. This is what you gave Grezzo. You gave them Miitopia. It's a shame.
We don't know what Grezzo is currently working on either.
No, we don't, because they are not working on that Advance Wars game, which I'm sure we'll talk about in the next segment. So, yeah, potentially another remake. Who knows what they're going to be doing, but we'll have to wait and see. That, however, is going to close out the first part of the show. We'll be back after the break with some stuff. Talk about Nintendo's E3 and that type of thing. See you in a bit. Alright everyone, welcome back to the second half of the show. We are going to do a little bit of mopping up, a little bit of wrapping up of E3 stuff and Nintendo, because we got to watch a bunch of Treehouse things and stuff that they showed off that we can go in a little bit more detail on now. And yeah, some other things as well, including Bally, are predictions that we made before the show that we didn't really talk about last time, but we made them, and let's see how we did. Let's see how many we got correct. Did we get any points at all? Tell me what's going on, Bally.
Right, let's run through your predictions first. Okay, so your first prediction was Metroid Visions, a new 2D side-scrolling Metroid set after Fusion. Subtle nod to it being Metroid 5 with the Visions name, involved Samus seeing flashbacks to the Chozo past, and the player would play through those past sequences as a Chozo character and have a dual protagonist. I love that idea. You got to get a full point for this, right? Like, you're hinting at Metroid 5, the game after Fusion.
I did say Metroid 5, didn't I, right? And they literally show Metroid 5 on the screen.
Totally.
So
that is a very clear full point. That's the first time in a long time I can remember us getting a clear full point. So
I mean, none of the details are correct at all, but new 2D Metroid called Metroid 5.
You got a 2D Metroid set after Fusion. That's perfect. Right.
Yes.
Next one, Xeno Collection. Tetsuya Takahashi will announce that Xenoblade 3 exists and is being worked on, but due to COVID, development has been slower. And we're going to need some more time. In the meanwhile, he'll announce Xeno Collection, bringing together Xenogears and every Xenosaga game into one big collection. And it'll be the first of many to arrive on Nintendo consoles. These will be HD updates with minimal changes. If you'd just gone for Monkey Ball, this basically is that game.
I know. Oh man, the Monkey Ball dream, I think I felt been dead for a long time. So I was like, am I ever going to do that again? No, probably not. Because I feel like I've predicted Monkey Ball in the past, or at least done some kind of Monkey Ball prediction. But yeah, did not do that this time. And we didn't see hide nor hair of Xenoblade.
No,
so
surprising.
Yeah.
Surprising. And finally, Donkey Kong World. This is the EPD Tokyo team, and it will have some nods to Donkey Kong 64. This was like your whole like retro kind of inspired, celebrating Donkey Kong in Nintendo's history idea, which I thought sounded awesome. And yeah, we don't know what that EPD Tokyo team is working on, whether it's this Donkey Kong game or Odyssey 2 or something else. So that's something that's probably going to be the number one slot for E3 next year, I'd imagine.
I think so.
Who
Yeah.
knows?
Zelda and that probably is going to be, and it'll be a repeat of 2017. Hopefully, that would be nice.
Oh, now you're talking. And then crazy guest, Fire Emblem Radiance Reborn.
That's a fake prediction. I didn't say that. Mine was Nintendo vs. Capcom.
Right, exactly. Nintendo versus Capcom, which I think is also an awesome idea. And hey, we got Street Fighter versus Tekken. Is that slightly?
I mean,
different,
in Smash Brothers,
Smash Brothers.
Yeah, not quite, but
yeah, 1 point, one solid point. I think
there we go.
That's pretty good. Okay, so my predictions. I predicted Mercury Steam 2D Metroid, and it won't be Mercury Steam 2D Metroid. It'll actually be Grezzo, and it'll be like a Super Metroid remake. It will be mechanically way closer to a game like Link's Awakening remake with a fresh coat of paint. We got 2D Metroid. It wasn't my prediction.
No, it was not.
I might argue for half a point, but I'm okay if you want to give me nil.
Yeah, I mean, wrong developer. It wasn't a remake. Yeah, I can't abide by it, unfortunately.
Hey, I predicted 2D Metroid and it came. I should get something.
Well, I don't know. We'll give you a pity point.
Pity half point. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Co-op gameplay will be revealed for Breath of the Wild 2. It'll be designed around the ground up as a single player game, but it will also be multiplayer, like swapping between characters in Pikmin or something like that. I said, obviously means playable Zelda is confirmed. It will be small parts where timing is required, and you control both characters, etc., etc. You can swap between Zelda or Link, and the other one remains on your horse for single player focused areas. If they are going to pull something Zelda playable or anything co-op related out of the bag, I just don't see it. And it certainly wasn't shown this time. And Zelda falling into a pit doesn't give hope.
I think all of our hopes of playing a Zelda was, her falling and being, I don't know.
But that might be a take, like a bait and switch, I do think there's...
I was going to say that, they could potentially be like, oh, well, Zelda's gone, and then actually you do play as her in a separate section underneath.
Yeah, I have seen the theory floating around. I think like Tim might have been going with this one, where he's talking about like Triforce, 3 planes of action, Zelda, Ganondorf, Link. There's theories that the person in the sky is actually Ganondorf. What if that meant you played as Zelda underground and Link on the surface, and you're going between the 3 planes of action? Like, I wouldn't rule out that prediction, honestly. Like, I think something to do with planes of action and Zelda being one of those planes, I think is still perfectly likely. If it
seems very ambitious, but
it's ambitious. Will it be co-op? I highly doubt it. So I'm going to take 0 points from that.
Yeah.
I stuck with my guns that the Odyssey team were going to be working on Odyssey 2. They might still be, but it wasn't announced this time.
Nope.
And it would come out this year. And the game for this year was actually Metroid Dread. So that kind of filled that slot. And I predicted in the next few days, but before E3 we'd hear about Switch Pro, and that it basically wouldn't be marketed it'd be under the Switch umbrella, and they'd do hardly any marketing around it. But obviously we don't know anything about the Switch Pro at the time of recording, so I'll take 0 points for that. I said Chibi Ridley will be in Smash. Unfortunately that wasn't the case. We don't have Chibi Ridley in Smash yet. Master Chief in Smash, nope. I said he's actually going to be in Mario Kart. Yeah, we saw no Mario Kart 9, so the Mario Kart wait goes on.
Yeah.
I'll take half a point. You get a solid victory, the full point. Solid predictions as ever.
And the only victory I need is that we're getting a new 2D Metroid. That's all I need, man.
It's been a long time. So this is one thing that really annoyed me, and I tweeted this, and it's every time in Treehouse they would like, the 3 presenters would be like, and it's been 19 years since and they'd say it in like this fangirl kind of way, and it's like, whoa, you're representing Nintendo here. You don't get to play the card we've been waiting 19 years when you're like linked to the company making the damn game. Like this is on, it's the way they were talking about it as like Nintendo was this other entity that and in some ways I guess NCL is this
I was going to say that like in many ways that's kind of the case. Like those people who work at Treehouse are all massive Nintendo fans, of course, like you kind of have to be to get a job at that company, but also you know, they don't know shit, like, in terms of, or they know shit because obviously they get the games and they have to localize them early and all that stuff, but they have zero control on what Nintendo makes or what decisions are made in terms of what they bring back. So in some ways,
yeah, they're just a marketing team, totally.
Yeah, in some ways they are like being genuine. That like, whoa,
they are. Hello, we are Nintendo.
Our company actually did this
company.
thing.
We would like you to market this game to the English-speaking world, please. Thank you, and make us some money. Thank you. Okay, bye. And yeah, that's about it. But yeah, it's frustrating, regardless of that relationship. That it's like 19 years. It's like Nintendo are responsible for this 19-year break.
Yes,
no one else.
yes.
Like, let's not try and pretend it's otherwise.
Yeah, like celebrating it as if
hilarious.
it's some kind of like magical reawakening when like
Yeah.
you could have made this at some point. Although I don't know, there was an interesting video that Nintendo World Report put up about the road to getting Metroid Dread made, and the idea of what happened post-Fusion was the structure regarding Nintendo's R&D teams changed, which meant that Sakamoto didn't really have a full team at Nintendo anymore to make a project like a new 2D Metroid. And so the whole notion of being able to do this was basically he had to go and find another developer to do it, and it seems like it has taken that long, right? Because there was all of those pieces of art that came out of Next Level, remember? The kind of Guacamelee style Samus and that stuff, which in some ways is a theory that Sakamoto went to next level and were like, okay, we'll try and make a 2D Metroid with you guys. Obviously they went on to make Federation Force, which is a totally different thing, but I think it definitely makes sense within what he was saying with that pre-presentation before Treehouse.
He also said he wasn't happy with the hardware. Like there was something about the DS that he just felt it wasn't like powerful enough for the vision he had of what he wanted Dread to be.
Right. And this idea, I think, of the Emmys who are stalking you constantly, and like the AI, maybe it has something to do with the AI of those creatures or something along those lines. Maybe it's something that we haven't even seen yet from the game that will be revealed later on. But yeah, that was another thing of he felt that they couldn't achieve the vision of what the game wanted to be. I don't know if I'd read too much into that. That feels maybe a little marketing speak in some senses.
That's Nintendo covering their asses for not releasing a game for 19 years.
Yeah, totally. Like I think it's much less. I think it's much more about practicality than anything regarding vision necessarily. But
I think Samus Returns looks great on 3DS. It looks different.
It does.
It looks unique, but I still think I really do like what they did art style wise with that game.
Yeah, I mean, I would take the Zero Mission and Fusion style over that any day, but that's just my personal preference. Pixel art is always going to win for me. You know, that's why I prefer the GBA Fire Emblems versus what they're doing with Three Houses. Like, it's a modern 3D game, but I'll always take those animations and those sprites over polygonal models, right? Because there's just a level
pitch, of and you can argue that let me get this word right, the octopathification of the industry. But what if you had Octopath style 2D Metroid where Samus and enemies and aspects are pixelated, but you're in a more like 2.5 3D setting?
I mean, I would fucking love that, of course, cool. But yeah, that's not going to happen.
And what if Sakamoto really did need that hardware boost, and that's why he's waited all the way until actually the Switch Pro, and this game is going to be linked some way to that.
Yeah, I feel like Dread is exciting that it's happening, and I'm really curious about the structure of it and how it is going to be paced, because the idea of you starting at the bottom and working your way to the top suggests linearity in a way, in a similar vein to Samus Returns, because as much as Samus Returns is still fully explorable and that stuff, it is still relatively linear in terms of you kind of go down into the planet, then go back up again the other side, you know? So I wonder how much influence Samus Returns has on this game. It already has done in terms of the melee stuff, but how much more is the thing for me.
But also Fusion was a very linear Metroid as well, and if it's a sequel to that, you know, like it does seem like it is more linear focused, and some things I kind of learned from the Treehouse, like I do like the look of it. I think that again there are some small mechanics that Nintendo will be like, this is the new best thing ever. Like the slide is great, but like the amount they talk about it and focus on it, I hope there's not a disparity between the what Nintendo thinks how impactful this game is going to be versus what we will think the game's going to be. And it's hard to judge just based on the first few levels. And I really hope the game goes places and looks stunning later on.
There's certainly like areas that have more visual diversity in what we had seen. Like there's the big kind of cavernous area which had the big boss hollow enemy who had the invisibility cloak in the background that like moves off onto the side, and then you fight him later.
So did you see the follow-up where they fight that boss?
Yes, I did, yeah. And that's where you get that ability from, which is very similar to Fusion, which is you beat bosses and get their power up through the X Parasite. So this seems like it's doing a similar thing, which I like. I always enjoyed the fact that Fusion was like, all right, here's Ceres. And Ceres, the whole point of that boss fight is it's really fast, and it goes around this arena, and then when you beat it, you get the ability to be really fast. I love that notion. So.
It's cool. I'm excited for it. I don't know what I want more in 2D Metroid, but I think there is scope that I don't think what they showed that improves on the Samus Returns formula in 2017. As much as it's had a glow up, which is fantastic, and that was expected, that's the bare minimum in many ways. Mechanically, I need to see a bit more. Like I think the slide is good. I think the bosses are good. I think the this new enemy that like chases you is really cool, but I'm gonna need a lot more than that if this is gonna be like my favorite 2D Metroid, because I think the others will take some beating.
Yeah, certainly, and I hope it distinguishes itself, and I think it's already starting to do that. The other thing they brought over, right, is the Aeon powers, which they were talking a little bit about, and so that invisibility thing is classed as a quote-unquote Aeon power, but I think it's done in a slightly different way to the way they did it on 3DS, where that was mainly just like, your bullets are super powerful now and you can shred shit, and I can't remember much else. I think there were other abilities tied to Aeon powers in terms of like searching the environment to find hidden stuff, that type of thing. But I wonder, I don't know, it's like handling a kind of magic meter almost, which I'm not sure how I feel about, and it was okay in Samus Returns, but
I mean, they've done similar meters in like the Prime games, especially Prime 2, where you're balancing like 3 different meters at one point, and I actually really like what they did with that stuff, where it's much more focused and makes you think about when and how you're shooting and how you take down enemies and how you traverse the environment, which I think is what they're really going for, where it felt like the host, I think it was Teresa, her name is, like, it felt like she was getting caught on purpose at times. And
she definitely, when this Emmy was chasing her in that first segment around that area, it felt like she just kept going around and around to try and make it feel like it was natural that she got caught. And it's,
right.
I totally get like the Treehouse ideal of, we want to make this feel like it's real gameplay, despite the fact they probably practiced for like 10 hours before even doing this to get like the perfect run and stuff. And
then they act out like, oh,
they
I
act
got
like,
caught,
oh no,
and this,
whoa,
like, this is cringe and horrendous, and I just want to see this game. But,
I know,
she comes back to that area later with the power up, and the what's it called, an Emmy,
EMMI, which I'm not sure what it stands for, but it seems like it is a Galactic Federation robot.
It's a Galactic Federation me.
What do you mean by me?
Me's. Nintendo. It's a bad joke, but yeah, it's like it's funny because it's called like a me, like a me, like
me.
But anyway,
yeah.
But yeah, so she gets the power up, and then the power up makes you invisible, and the Emmy kind of comes and sees her, and then she turns it on, and it turns around, and she didn't make clear how that mechanic specifically works. Whether the second you go invisible, it will ignore you and move away, because after that, she starts getting chased, and I'm like, why don't you turn it on now? Why doesn't it work now? Can you explain why it's not working now? And it wasn't clear how that interacts, the invisibility cloak, with the enemy.
Yeah, I think she was just being not stupid about it, but like doing it in very specific moments, right?
Yeah.
To be like, we're explaining this now, so we're going to do it in this one time, even though she could do it any time, it seemed like. As long as you have that meter up, it seems like you could do it. But yeah, some other interesting stuff. I think the slide is going to be really crucial. And I think one of the reasons why the slide is crucial is because this idea of this thing chasing you, you can't spend the time of like going down to Morph Ball, then moving. There's a little like less momentum with a Morph Ball when it comes to that stuff. And so maintaining your speed and movement with the slide feels like really important stuff. And I think overall the game feels so fast, right? And that's what I want. I definitely want a game that is snappy in movement and like is able to get places quickly. And that's kind of what this game is going for, it seems. So having that like added to the arsenal feels like a really great, smart addition that I'm excited about, and I think it's going to be really good. The stuff about Adam is interesting as well, because obviously Adam, maligned mainly in Other M for the idea that you can't use any of your power-ups until he says you can, which is it's a choice. And it's a weird kind of part of that game, and Samus's like weird paternal relationship with him and stuff is just not well handled. It's just writing is bad. Other M has issues, let's be honest. But Adam, the AI in Fusion, which the AI is named after that character, right? Retroactively, of course, because Fusion was made way years before Other M even existed. Adam is here again, and they really, really interestingly, actually, they pointed out, they were like, so Adam's here. He won't tell you where to go. He won't like point you to a map and a spot. And it's almost like they're dunking on Fusion in a way. They're almost like dunking on the previous Metroid games that people had issues with, which I've never had too much of an issue with Fusion's linearity, because that game is like fun and fast and frenetic and linear in a way that I find fine. But there's lots of people out there who don't like Fusion because it is segmented and you do have to go these different places because you're...
And Adam is very chatty. There's a lot of...
Yeah, he can be quite chatty.
Yeah.
For sure. So I wonder if like they pare that back a bit more, and they are less focused on an overt narrative through dialogue and more going back to the Super Metroid style of, narrative through gameplay. That would be interesting, and I think like that's kind of what it feels like they were getting at, right? Is like, hey, don't worry, people who love Super Metroid, where there's none of this dialogue stuff. It's not going to tell you where to go. We swear. Which I thought was interesting, coming from the Treehouse people. That was one of the points.
Are we going to see the return of like Ridley and Kraid and all the big mother brain?
I don't know. You know what? I kind of hope not. Because one of the cool things about Fusion is like, obviously Ridley is in there in some form because Ridley fucking has to be, and I wouldn't be surprised if like Ghost Ridley or Emmy Ridley, like Robot Emmy Ridley or something is in this facility or some shit like that. That would make sense because Ridley has to be in every Metroid game. But there are so many cool bosses in Fusion that are different from what you get before in the previous games. Every game has its own specific set of enemies. Obviously the original Metroid has the most basic ones that we all know. Metroid 2 has the evolving Metroids, the different forms of the Metroids as you go through. Super Metroid has the classic bosses of Kraid and the weird ghost ship boss and all those guys, and then Fusion has its own group of folks. But the Prime games, it felt, obviously did some of that difference as well, but there always was like Ridley shows up, right? Like there feels like there has to be Ridley at least in there, and it's just kind of inevitable. But yeah, I would prefer if they went a bit more outside the box. And I am curious about like, why is Samus here? What's going on? Because the end of Fusion, spoilers for Fusion, it's a fucking 20-year-old game. Should have played it. If you haven't, skip ahead like 20 seconds or whatever. End of Fusion, Samus is basically wanted. She has crashed this entire facility into a planet. It's destroyed. The Galactic Federation are basically after her. So how has she ended up on this planet, deep within this planet, with these robots there that are like potentially made by the Galactic Federation? Has she been like sealed in prison or something? Has she been caught and she's trying to escape? I'm just really interested in the setup for this. And I've never been like massive on the lore or the world.
We're going to have to play Federation Force and find out.
Oh, yes, the hidden link, of course. Yeah,
exactly.
That's where it is. I lost Psylocke's chat in Federation Force, apparently. Psylocke seems to be an interesting element there because he was in Prime 3, I believe, as well as, he was debuted in Hunters, Metroid Prime Hunters, which where all those other bounty hunters come from. It seems like Psylocke is the one who Sakamoto has decided is important to the wider Metroid story, so potentially...
The bit of Metroid Prime 3 I did play, I believe I got to him, actually. I remember.
Okay.
Is he the one that, like, on the ice that kind of...
No, he's kind of got like a green suit with like weird spiky shoulder stuff going on.
Okay, who am I thinking of? Who's like the one on ice who kind of walks on ice?
Honestly, don't remember the name of any of those bounty hunters except for Psylocke, because that's the one that they have made important in their mind. So yeah, it was really cool to see the game and see a good chunk of it, like getting a really good sense of how it plays, what it looks like, and stuff like the map room not showing the areas, which is different in fact from Fusion, which does show you the areas. It just doesn't show you the whole thing. It shows you the basic path, but all the hidden areas are still hidden, and this goes one step further. It doesn't even show you the kind of square block parts. It just shows you the general area of where you can go, which I think is leaning in again to that more level of exploration that is going on within this game. So yeah, I feel like it will be similar to Samus Returns in that sense of these when you transition between areas, as they did in the elevator, the elevator shot is similar to the Samus Returns one, just a bit more zoomed in on Samus's torso and stuff like that. But the transition and going to a new space seems like it is a little bit more segmented. So I wonder if it's like within those spaces there is exploration, but getting from one to the next is always going to be a linear progression. But it would be nice if there were other ways, right? It would be nice if you could get to the fourth area before the third area or something like that by taking a different path from someone else. And yeah, I think we're still to wait to see if that is going to be possible. But I think it would be cool, and it would add another kind of element to the game.
It felt like it had the kind of elevator system that we've seen in like the Metroid Prime games, especially, where it's kind of there are distinct areas that have multiple entrance and exits, and you can go between areas through different means. So it's fairly non-linear, hopefully.
Yeah, and to defend the 3D style of it in some senses, because I my reaction to Samus Returns was not super positive because I wasn't a big fan of the 2.5D thing, and in the end I think the 3D on 3DS and that game looked great regardless. I think it was still a good looking game. This looks way better than that in my opinion. I've seen a lot of people dunking on it, but I think it looks so smooth and crisp and clean, and it's clearly running at a higher frame rate. It's just a really nice looking thing. But I think what they proved with that opening cutscene was one of the benefits of 2.5D is that you can rotate around these characters and do directed cutscenes in an environment that you just couldn't do with pixel art, right? Like you wouldn't be able to have that same level of depth or immersion in the space where like this opened up, and I wasn't even sure if it was a 2D Metroid to begin with because Samus was fully rendered and the Emmy comes after her and it's all camera angles and all this stuff, and it's not showing you just a side-on perspective storytelling wise. So I think there is a benefit in terms of doing a narrative here that you can actually have real dynamic cutscenes because it has chosen to be a 2.5D game. So I thought that was actually an interesting point that I hadn't really thought of before, and I don't think many 2.5D games actually try that, but it does seem like a cool benefit of it. So yeah. Any other thoughts on what we saw on Samus Returns? I like that climbing mechanic where you're kind of, it's almost like a Twilight Princess Iron Boots style, like magnetically walking.
Yeah. It's interesting that there was literally about 2 seconds of Morph Ball in the trailer, and then the Morph Ball wasn't utilized a single time in the gameplay. So the Morph Ball seems like it's one of the power-ups you get a little bit later than you might otherwise.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. I think that's just to really show off the fact that like Samus is hanging on to these sticky walls in other ways, and you're shooting while moving, that's the sort of thing that I just don't think other systems might have had the power for. Like it's a very clear thing. Like you are multiple moving things on the screen happening that you're influencing. So I think that stuff looks interesting. I hope there is some solid Morph Ball stuff later. I'm sure there will be. I'm just really interested what are the secrets behind like the later stuff in this game between enemies, power-ups, the story. Like I'm really excited for that. And they definitely felt like they were building towards that, where they kind of cut early to avoid a few even early on cutscenes, which was interesting.
Yeah, and in terms of them like listening to people, obviously I talked about the Adam thing and like him directing you and then being like, well, he doesn't do that anymore. The other thing that's interesting is one of my biggest complaints about Samus Returns, especially the beginning. Remember, I don't think I kind of have this as a cool thing in my mind, but when I first started playing Samus Returns, that first couple of hours, I was like, this game sucks. I fucking hate this shit. And the main reason was the stupid melee counter that you had to stand still, wait for an enemy to come, do the melee counter, and then kill them, because they were so much more sponges without killing them with the melee counter that it was...
Yeah, they really emphasized that they wanted you to melee, especially early on.
They wanted you to do it, and it was such a momentum killer, because the thing I love about Metroid is just forward momentum, movement, just never stopping, it's always going, and they have clearly listened to that, taken the feedback on board, and created a much more fast-paced, like active melee counter where you can go ahead and just parry them basically straight ahead, and Samus will like do this awesome flip and then like shoot behind her. It looks sick as hell, and it's so much more it's just a better way of handling that idea. and it's still a cool idea. Like, I like the melee counter in concept. I think that the start of the 3DS game, however, just didn't nail its execution. And I think this, out the gate, already is looking like a much more streamlined, much more smarter way to approach that type of situation. So, yeah, I think I'm just coming out of this very positive. It's only a few months away. I'm very excited. So, looking forward to that.
Looking forward to it.
WarioWare was another one that they showed off very briefly, similar to WarioWare's brevity they kind of were talking about, of like, well, it's a short game with micro games, let's do a short segment, only 10 minutes long, so we got a very brief look at it, but some things were clarified. You choose kind of a team of WarioWare characters every time you go into a set of mini games. So you choose 3 characters, and the game will, I guess, randomly go between them every time you do a micro game, and so you'll play as different characters regarding whatever micro game you're doing, and they all have different abilities. Wario kind of flies around with the hover stuff. I think it is 18 Volt who like sits on the ground but shoots stuff out of himself to affect things. I think Orbulon uses his UFO underneath kind of what do you call it when you get sucked up to the sky in a UFO, his tractor beam thing to affect things. And it's interesting. I don't know if I'm fully sold on this idea with WarioWare yet. It feels like a bit detached in a way, that you're using these characters to do the action instead of just the random figure it out on the fly. One of the other things they do is similar to the Wii game, Shake It is the wrong. That's not it. What's it called? The Wii
Smooth Moves.
Smooth Moves. That's the one. Smooth Moves showed you the poses before you did a micro game, and this, the characters as they are sitting there in the kind of in-between state, shows you, for this mini game, you're going to use the move and you're also going to use the A button. So it gives you a little bit of a heads up, because you're switching between characters as well, like it's an added layer, gives you a heads up of like which buttons will do what in the upcoming mini game, which is good, but it could take away from some of the surprise in some ways. So I don't know. How did you feel about this presentation of WarioWare?
It grew on me a ton. I think when it was revealed in the Direct itself, I was a little nervous about the style, but I think the fact that you do like pick a sort of mini team of 3 and then it seems to randomly rotate between the 3 of them, I think it gives, it's like creativity through simplicity with the style of the mini games. Like, I think it forces you to approach the games differently, which could like make the games feel a lot more fresh, to the fact that you are mixing up the characters you're playing with them as. And yeah, I can appreciate, I think Ben Hansen on MinMax was saying how it might detract a little bit from the style of WarioWare, which is like the art styles in those mini games stand apart so solidly, where it's just one wacky art style to another. And if you've got this kind of rendered, cell shaded, strange 3D 2D character jumping around, does that detract a bit from the overall art of the game? Which I think is interesting, and I kind of agree to an extent. But ultimately, if the gameplay is good and it feels good and it still feels like it's, you know, snappy and fun in co-op and stuff like that, I think it will be really good. Like, and they made clear, like in the Treehouse, like, yeah, this, and they just say it with a big smile on their face, this is local co-op, and I think they even say like it's local co-op only or something, and it's like, you guys know this should happen online, but obviously you can't say that. So yeah, another frustration with the Treehouse. But I thought it looked really good, and I think it's a game that worked well. Where when I found out the video was 10 minutes, I was a little disappointed, but I'm actually glad it's 10 minutes because I'm sold on it.
Yeah,
I want to buy it day one. I don't want to be spoiled on those games.
They also held back on the 9 volt section because everyone knows those are people's favorite mini games or micro games, and they only showed 3 of those. So yeah,
felt like it was the first time they really highlighted 9 volt as like this fan favorite that they had to be so cloak and dagger about, which I thought was interesting. It's like they really, in some ways, are quite aware of that audience, which is interesting.
Totally, yeah. Nintendo listen, man. Sometimes people just think they don't, but they clearly do. All that Metroid stuff so obviously shows that they do listen, which is just cool. I think we should keep that in mind. But yeah, WarioWare looked good. The last major one that I watched a lot of was Advance Wars, which they showed off. And as we had kind of mentioned before, being made by Way Forward, which is really interesting because we had speculated maybe Grezzo was working on it because the art style was similar to Link's Awakening. But way forward, man. They work quite closely with Nintendo on Shantae stuff, and they have done stuff in the past with them, but this seems like the most kind of direct collaboration they've had in a little while, and they're working on a first-party IP with Advance Wars. Impressive stuff. How do you feel about Advance Wars and the gameplay we got given, Bally?
It's solid. It's very much what I kind of expected, and the nature of the presentation was interesting, where imagine a world where this game was 2D Mario and not Advance Wars, and the last 2D Mario game, or the last 2D platformer we'd seen, actually came out 17 years ago or 13 years ago, however long it's been.
Yeah.
They were basically saying, this is a gap, this is your character, and you jump the gap. Like, you press the A button to jump. It's like they were breaking it down so much that it was like, for the real, I don't know what Advance Wars is, this is how it works kind of thing. And it's a shame we're in that position, because I want to be in a position where we all know what Advance Wars is, and we want to evolve on those mechanics and have a new game. But this is a step forward. This is introducing Advance Wars to a new era, a new audience, and it's only right that the Treehouse explain to them how this game works, because I think it is quite overwhelming when you see it on screen for the first time. It's like, my God, there's a lot of units. They all do these different things. The objectives, there's multiple objectives on maps and things like that. So yeah, as a bit of an Advance Wars veteran, it was like, right, okay, back to basics, but I still really want to play these games, and it looks fantastic. But I can appreciate they want to aim to as wide an audience as possible with this one.
For sure, yeah. It feels very much like a Link's Awakening style remake, where they are changing nothing except for the visuals, right? Like, mechanically, seemed like it was exactly the same. I don't know if you caught anything specific, but to me it seemed like that's that GBA game, but it doesn't look like pixel art anymore.
No, nothing really. And I think that this will actually see even fewer changes actually than Link's Awakening. What I mean by that is, one of the biggest flaws with Link's Awakening and the two Oracle games, having just played one, is the constant item swapping, like between weapons and things. And obviously the Link's Awakening remake fixed that. I don't think there's really much that can be fixed with that basic Advance Wars formula. It is so...
Are you calling Advance Wars perfect?
It is near perfect, if not perfect. It is such a strong formula that you can evolve the formula, but if you're replicating that first game, first two games, there's not actually anything in my mind you can do to suddenly improve the formula. I think the game does a fantastic job of telegraphing stuff like the damage, the defenses, the terrain, all these things that, sure, if you had played it on like DS, and I know the Dual Strike on DS, you got a lot more information on the bottom screen, and I like that about the DS Fire Emblem games, for example. That's one improvement, but obviously you can't do that with Switch. So yeah, it's basic, but I think that's what works best, because it's such a strong formula, and that will work best for new players especially. Really
interesting that these maps are kind of in a liminal space. They're just kind of like on a board almost, and you can see the wooden...
Really, I love that. Like proper toy soldiers kind of style. I think that's what I'm most excited for, is just that art style, because I thought it just looked fantastic. Like the little soldier toy box kind of style, like a chessboard or something.
Totally, yeah, and it's I wonder what they'll do when they get to the bigger maps, because there are larger ones later on that I recall, especially one where there's this kind of fog and you have to go across all the way to the side in order to get there, and I think they probably do the same thing, but make it a little just like scroll across thing and still have the borders there, but yeah, I don't think any of the maps in Advance Wars are massive per se, because it is much more of a small, tight experience, but yeah, there are certainly bigger ones later on.
For sure. Yeah, it looks solid. I'm impressed. I really hope it sells well. I think I predicted before 2 million would be a really great number to get to, and I'm a bit nervous about it reaching that, to be honest. I think there's a lot of other stuff coming out. I think there's not many people like me who want Advance Wars back. I know that we're a vocal minority on social media and stuff, but I don't. I'm skeptical for people younger than 30 who own Switches, how interested they'll be in Advance Wars. I'm not sure.
I feel like that art style appeals to a Nintendo audience really well. So I feel like that's part of their attack strategy here, is people who played Link's Awakening who first game in Zelda was Breath of the Wild, and they were like, oh, captured by this new different art style and that type of thing. I think there's definitely potential there. There's also the factor of everything sells better on Switch, and I think there's something to be said of, in our era right now and the YouTube space and all that stuff, people having a lot more access to information about older games and what people were excited about back in the day. And there are big enough YouTubers out there who will hype up stuff like Paper Mario and Advance Wars and all these types of things. And a younger audience will be coming to those people and being like, oh, I never heard of this. Sounds really cool. Now is my chance to go and try it for the first time. And I really hope that's the case with Advance Wars, where people evangelize it and talk about how cool it is and show it off, and that results in a bunch of people who've never played it before coming to it for the first time, really enjoying it, becoming fans, and therefore giving Nintendo the boost that they probably want to see sales-wise to make them think, oh, okay, maybe we greenlight a brand new one, and maybe WayForward gets to make that, right? Maybe if WayForward do a good enough job on this, then they get the keys to the kingdom, and Nintendo partner with them like they did with Mercury Steam. It could very well be a similar situation with Mercury Steam, where you start with a remake, it does well, and then off you go, let's make a brand new one. That would be a really cool thing. So.
Yeah, totally. Fingers crossed. Buy these games, people. Buy them.
Yeah.
We've been waiting on Metroid, WarioWare, and Advance Wars a very long time. Let's back them.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I think the reason I reacted so strongly to this press conference was it's just like GBA nostalgia, this entire thing, right? Like, those series are so steeped in the handheld and GBA kind of era that for me is one of my most like nostalgic, like special gaming spaces. So that's probably why it worked so well for us overall. And yeah, I want to see Nintendo continue to dive back into that system and the favorites from there, because we still have stuff like Golden Sun, right, which has been sitting out in the dust for a long time since the DS.
F-Zero is another one that was big on GBA.
Totally.
We've not seen.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that system definitely had a lot of great stuff on it that I think, again, like that recently, I'm not sure if you saw Bally, but there was a rating for Castlevania Advance Collection.
I saw that, yeah.
That is very exciting, which will probably just be ports of those games, but the GBA Castlevania games, people can't play them easily unless you own a Wii U, which who does? It's hard to play those. So putting that out, that sounds great to me. It's the year of the GBA stuff. I'm here for it. I love it. So yeah, exciting stuff. But yeah, any other things around E3 that were related to Nintendo that you wanted to bring up, Bally? I guess with a lot of the indie game stuff, it's quite unclear of like what platforms they come to and that type of thing at the moment. But certainly a lot of indie games being announced around the period, and I'm sure a lot of them will come to Switch at some point.
And I mean, you'll know this working a publisher now, but many of them might not even know what they're going to launch on yet.
Absolutely, yes, that's very well the case.
Who knows?
For sure.
But yeah, I'm sure a big chunk of those will come to Switch day one probably. Maybe interesting that there basically weren't any indie games shown off in the direct. I don't know if
you're right. Yeah,
mention that. I felt like it was a big Silk Song hole. Like that would have been a big indie showstopper that I'm sure is wrapped up with Nintendo. But obviously that wasn't going to be at E3. We knew about that a few weeks in advance. But
yeah, I mean, we got more on Axiom Verge 2, saw a bit more of that game from Tom Happ, which was cool to see. I kind of feel bad for Tom Happ. He's putting out this game the same year Nintendo decides to bring back 2D Metroid, but I'm sure that game will be great. I really enjoyed the first Axiom Verge, and I will definitely play the second. But yeah, that one is a game that is definitely marketed directly with Nintendo because it is coming out on Switch first. So yeah.
So yeah, I think overall really strong. One thing I just wanted to pick up on was there was like a message from Nintendo put out sort of saying how people weren't going to be allowed to stream their live stream of the direct or something. That's really freaked out a few streamers, and I think Patrick Klepek did like an inquiry into this, and I think he asked someone at Nintendo, and the response he got was basically, yes, thank you for your inquiry, let me check with Nintendo. And it was basically like NOA essentially checking with NCL, Nintendo Japan, and it was all just like messy. And his theory, and I probably agree with this, is that there's a lot of stuff rules and things like that NCL are very keen on, that NOA basically let slide under the carpet or don't mention to NCL, and then occasionally NCL will just put out like a top-down big...
Occasionally they'll be told, like, this internet thing is happening. They're like, no, the internet, we can't let that be a thing.
Yeah.
Stop it right now. Lawyers, sue people.
Sharing our live stream of all these games we're trying to sell? No, we can't have that happening. Like, that's a terrible idea.
We can't expand our audience by having people excited about our video games on the internet. Of course not. That would be just definitely not a good idea. Yeah. It's like, I don't know, man. How long will it take for this to change? Will it ever change? I mean, when Persona 5 came out, Atlas was like, hey, you can't stream this game. We're not letting you. And it's like, fucking Atlas, get your head out your arses, you motherfuckers. It's infuriating, man. And Japanese companies are the worst for it. They continue to be the worst for it. And I don't see.
And as much as like Treehouse is done by, NOA, and it is very much a marketing thing, the idea of Treehouse is still like the most NCL thing you can possibly imagine. It's so sterile and, if this perfected live stream that is just demonstrating our game, no journalists on site, no one can ask questions about why isn't the morph ball like this? Why didn't this come out? What's going on here? It's just this journalism-free state broadcast.
It totally
Nintendo.
Is. Yeah, it's like the PR blast for sure. And here's a really interesting thing, which I don't know if you have listened to. Are you subscribed to the Nintendo Power podcast? They're like official Nintendo podcasts at all? Okay, I listen to it out of morbid curiosity, just like similar to the Treehouse thing of like, I just love how Nintendo frame things and talk about things. I've actually been thinking about doing a video on the whole notion when they talk about games in their directs of the Super Mario Golf Super Rush, the Mario Golf Super Rush game. Every game they talk about is always prefaced by the name of game, then game. Like the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild game is like how they talk about it, and it is wild and weird, and I don't understand. It's like your grandfather is talking about a video game. It's like it's nonsense.
Are they just trying to get in the full title?
I don't understand. I honestly have no fucking idea.
Or something, like we'd say Breath of the Wild 2 or the next Zelda. Or
it's so weird. It's like the Metroid Dread game will be released on, and it's like, okay, sure. I mean, just call it by its name, but fine. So there's an interview with Doug Bowser, and listen to this shit for 17 minutes. Honestly, it feels like everything he says, he is just reading from a piece of paper. Like, he doesn't know anything about any of the games, and everything he says, he's just, like, reading straight up. Especially because, like, there's a point where he has to say the names of both Hyrule Warriors expansions, and, like, come on, Doug Bowser doesn't know the name of the 2 fucking expansions for Hyrule Warriors, and it's so obvious and so clear that he is just sitting there basically reading a script as the host kind of tries to, like, get a conversation out of it, and he says nothing of interest whatsoever. It is incredibly PR. It is like even more PR than Reggie in a way. But I get no sense of his personality whatsoever. It is so weird and bizarre. You must listen to this segment. It is insane.
I think this is probably worth a segment of itself, but not to go off at a huge tangent. But it was so interesting when Reggie retired and he did a few podcasts, and he obviously did his own podcast, and just hearing about it all. And it sounds like the role Reggie created for himself was really Reggie pushing for that role. Like it wasn't so much NCL or Japan saying, we want a really loud head of NOA, English speaking Nintendo that is, the spokesperson. He had to like push himself to go to Japan and meet with Iwata and Miyamoto and these sorts of things, and really pushing that relationship and carving out like the more edgier kind of kicking ass, taking names persona that he portrayed.
Yeah, like in the GameCube era when they were trying to like get rid of the kiddie image in some senses, right?
Totally. And I do fear that him retiring and Bowser coming in, we might be back to square one on that relationship. And the little bit of marketing power that you could argue NOA might have had under Reggie might have just evaporated overnight when Bowser took over. I don't know, but that's certainly from what you said about this interview and the impression we've gotten from the few E3s we've had since Reggie's retired. Well, we've only had one, haven't we? That's the only one.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm fascinated by that relationship. I'm not sure much information will ever come out about it, but that's definitely the sense I get from it. I don't know.
Yeah, it's weird. I just recommend go listen to that podcast. It's yeah, I don't know. I was listening to it and I was like, he is literally like, I don't think he knows anything about any Nintendo games. I think he's just reading a piece of paper that he has in front of him and getting excited about things in a real fake PR-y way that is very obvious.
I think if we forget that if culturally Japan was more into speaking English than it is, and it's very not into speaking English as much as there's still a lot of signs in Japanese and English. Imagine all the executives, and I know this is the case for other companies, not in Japan, but other non-English speaking companies, they'll make sure like certain directors and board members or whatever speak English for like marketing reasons and all this sort of these reasons. If Nintendo did speak maybe more English, especially with their higher ups, I'm skeptical if NOA and Treehouse would even exist. Like, I think the whole English aspect of it, I think, is so important to them.
It's really interesting because Furukawa is an English speaker. Like, he speaks fluent English, and yet we haven't really had much interview stuff with him.
Yeah, he's just decided he doesn't want that forward-facing role, which...
no, definitely not.
It's unusual for Nintendo, but probably is very normal for other Japanese companies. You know,
or maybe it was just unique with Iwata, right? Maybe totally. I think that's the thing that is
for so long he was the face and introduced directs and these sorts of things.
And like that's the unique thing about Iwata is that he came from development, right? Like he's the rare head of company that actually was in the trenches making video games, which is why he was so unique in that position. Because it's so rare for that to happen. It's so often that the business people are the people on top, right? And the people who are disconnected from the games.
And the spokespeople at the moment, Koizumi and Takahashi, they're both obviously development backgrounds.
Yes,
so,
totally.
Like, they clearly want, at some level, it is important for them to have the developers front and center, which is good.
Totally, yeah. Koizumi has become the kind of face of the Japanese arm of Nintendo in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, and I think that works, honestly, and I like that they were both presenting this one. But yeah, I wish they would do a bit more fun stuff, because that's what I miss the most, I think, about that era.
It's much harder, I think, to do the fun stuff with the language barrier. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah.
It's also one of those
Iwata
things...
speaking English definitely helped that with the Reggie Iwata stuff for sure.
Totally.
It made a big difference, but... Yeah.
It's also one of those things where, and this didn't happen much in the direct, it just happened a little bit, but there's sometimes when they are still talking and the subtitles are on and then they're showing off a new game at the same time, and you're doing this annoying combination of reading subtitles and trying to watch a new game that's being shown at the same time.
Yeah.
It can really, really clash. So I'm not saying they have to be English speaking, but they just sometimes need to balance it a bit better with the timings, especially when you're using subtitles.
For sure.
Video production perspective. But
yeah, and honestly, I think they did it was very slick. Clearly, they were very far away from each other, very COVID safe. Those chairs were distance apart.
The time delay between their snaps.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, you had going around the world in terms of that stuff. So, yeah, it was good. I enjoyed it overall, and I think, good stuff to look forward to. But that is going to close out the show. Bally, where can people go to support the show and help it and all those good things?
You can support us on Twitter. Follow us there at TNL Podcast. We'd hugely appreciate a follow if you haven't already. Come join our Discord community. That's always a great fun. We've been talking a lot about Fantasy Critic, which we're all taking part in at the moment. Loads of bids going on with Nintendo, which has been really exciting. So join the community. We've got like 100 strong community, which is awesome. So yeah, link to that on our Twitter account and in the show notes of this show. So join the community. You can also support us on Patreon. We will have a Patreon show going out later this week, hopefully, talking about everything that was non-Tendo at E3. Now you might argue that that's not much, but there's definitely a few things we want to check in with. So you can support us for $1 to check out all of our episodes of our other show, ThisNintendoLife.
Fantastic. Yep, you can head over to patreon.com/ThisNintendoLife to support, and we'd like to thank some of our supporters.
Yes, thank you to our $10 tier patrons. They are Zach S, Atari Alex, Thomas, Matthew, and my fiance Caroline. Thank you so much for your support, and thank you to all of our other patrons. It's hugely appreciated, all the support you give the show.
Absolutely. Of course, you can find us on Twitter as well. I am at LordNBZ. Where are you, Bally?
I am at Ballyman91. That's BALLYMAN 91.
Great stuff. You can also follow us all over the place in terms of downloading the podcast. We're on Spotify, we're on Stitcher, we're all over the shop. So go and download the show wherever it is so convenient for you. Subscribe to it, review us, all those good things. And we would appreciate it. But yeah, that is going to close things out. My throat is very, very on the edge of, wanting to explode. So I'm going to just get on out of here and finish things. I made it to the end somehow, and it's trying to break through now. I'm not going to let it back. God damn it. It's attacking me.
We're going to wrap up the show.
We've got to wrap it up, Bally.
You in a 2 weeks' time on This Nintendo Life. That is goodbye from us.
The musical interlude used on today's show was Palace from Ever Oasis, copyright Nintendo 2017.